So Gavin Ortlund just put out this absolutely fascinating video on St. John Henry Newman, on John Henry Newman. And he talks about in this video the development of doctrine and his disagreements as a Protestant with certain things in Newman. He talks about where he appreciates him and also where he disagrees. And in this video, I want to give my reaction as a high church Anglican to some of the claims that he makes in this video. So real quick, guys, my name is Colin. I want to welcome you to the Nicaea 3 YouTube channel. Stoked to have you guys with us today. We actually just hit 100 subs, which I'm pretty stoked about. So we're now on the journey to 1,000. If you like this content, keep in mind that a subscription can really help this channel to grow in its early stages. So I want to give a quick plug for that really quickly. Okay, so with that said, let's hop into the content for today. So this is a fairly heavy-hitting video that Dr. Gavin Ortlund makes, a man that I very much so respect, where he tries to work through some of the distinctions that he sees as a church historian who's also a Protestant. He's coming from the Baptist tradition, but certainly he comes with some serious claims that he makes, and is a fairly scholarly video and a scholarly man. And what I want to do in this video is I want to talk about some of the places where I would find agreement with certain things that he says, certain approaches that he takes, and also state some disagreements where I myself, again, as a high church Anglican, am very much so indebted to the work of St. John Henry Newman and to his theological method, a man who was just named as a doctor of the Universal Church alongside St. Thomas Aquinas. So I really want to look at some of the claims he makes in this video and kind of try to parse it out. And then at the end, I'm going to he in the video gives two different paradigms that you can work through to figure out how to work through being deep in church history and what conclusions that should lead you to. I actually want to give a third paradigm that I personally believe is actually the future of Christendom. I think it's the way that the official ecumenical dialogues handle some of these fairly challenging questions in a non-polemical manner. And I'm not saying that he's polemical. I think he works very hard to actually not be that. However, I do think this third paradigm that I want to present, based more so on the ecumenical dialogues that have already occurred at official levels in the church, that I think that this gives a new paradigm for how we can work through things. I also think this is the method overall of Vatican II, and also the method of Anglicanism, reading the scriptures at the feet of the fathers. Okay, so a couple places of agreement that I'd like to just start out by noting. Again, as an Anglican, the Anglican method is reading the scriptures at the feet of the fathers, basically full stop. I would also say in light of the tradition and in reason, but reading the Bible at the Church of the Fathers is a basic starting place for the Anglican theological method. And I appreciate Dr. Ortlund's sense of wanting to do just this. Actually, we've seen this recently affirmed by certain voices within the Roman Catholic Church that this is a good theological method to work from. So I appreciate his instincts and his irenicism in trying to approach it that way. Also, and I want to be very careful how I state this, certainly at the time of the Reformation, there are things that need reforming. And so what he does is he traces out a long list of things, and you can find this in works like from the Reformed tradition, from Turretin, or certainly in the confessional Lutheran traditions. You can find various responses to things like the Council of Trent, where certain particularities are laid out, such as views on purgatory, views on, prayer to the saints, views on things like pilgrimages and just the system of merit in general that sometimes you see in the Middle Ages. And certainly these are also serious responses to the Council of Trent, okay? Now, one thing, again, that Dr. Ortlund does specifically that I think is helpful is he tries to lay all of these things out and then say, where was the patristic consensus? And then he uses the word accretion a lot. Were there certain accretions that occurred over time that built things up? Okay, so he shows some level of understanding when he's a fairly deep level of understanding as he's working through and talking about these things. However, with that said, again, that's something that I appreciate his method to try and clarify things that are being said. He tries to get modern day Protestantism out of the non-denominational kind of general landscape and back into historic Protestantism, which I think is helpful. And so I appreciate those things and certain aspects of that method. For I do think that in reflection, both obviously the inheritors of various Protestant traditions, as well as the Roman Catholic Church herself, as shown in the Counter-Reformation, and then in later developments such as Vatican II, have also shown this notion that there were certain things that needed reforming. And so I appreciate certain of his instincts there, okay? However, there are some places I would explicitly disagree with him, and that's mostly what I want to hop into this video and again give a third sort of a framework for working through this. But before I get to the framework, a couple places where I would see some level of disagreement. So for one, and this is very complicated, but I think it's very, very important to grasp. I once had one of my seminary professors from Asbury Theological Seminary put it this way. As Americans, we basically swim in reformed waters as far as thought. Like your average American Christian thinks in reformed categories. And this is not meant to be a polemic against the reformed tradition. I do think, however, it's fairly accurate. In general, the reformed tradition does tend to lead people to thinking of things in terms of black or white, right or wrong, because it works through basically systematic theology, okay? Now, of course, systematic theology in many, many ways is a great thing, okay? But the other thing it can do is it can leave you stuck in certain ways of thinking that I actually believe somebody like a figure like John Henry Newman is trying to get us beyond black and white thinking to, well, as an Anglican, I would say more contextual lines of thinking, okay? So this is the big rub here. In general, inheritors from the German theological tradition and from Reformed traditions in general are based more in systematic theology, whereas inheritors of the English mind and of the English tradition are based more so in contextual or historical theology, okay? So one particular place where you can see this play out, and I won't go into depth about this here, but this is just one example, okay? And this is what somebody like St. John Henry Newman's trying to do in Tract 90. He's trying to get beyond the disagreements of the Council of Trent and the 39 Articles of religion from the Church of England, okay? So one quick example, okay? The Articles of Religion, you can argue as an Anglican, are deeply, deeply indebted within they're ingrained within their contextual reality of medieval Christendom and of the medieval mind. Therefore, the things that are rebutted in something like the 39 Articles don't necessarily have to align with the words that they are saying as understood today. So for example, when it speaks about transubstantiation, when you read, and I'll get to this here shortly, but when you read, for example, the Archic documents, which is the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. So this is the group that's officially recognized by the Anglican Communion and by the Vatican Office for Promoting Christian Unity. When you read some of their documents that have come out, such as the one on the Eucharist in 1971, okay, what they do is they try to get beyond the philosophical Aristotelian metaphysical framework that's laid out in a polemical way, where it's like, okay, in the Roman Catholic Church, you have to believe in this notion of transubstantiation, and a lot of times people think that that means fleshly. They kind of project onto that. They project this medieval framework, whereas really the Thomistic viewpoint and framework of transubstantiation was more about substance, which in a Greek philosophical category is more so about what it really, really is at the core. If you want a good theologian to look to for this, you can look at the work Transubstantiation by, his name is slipping me right now, Dr. Gavin Ortlund, Brett Salkeld. You can look at the work done by Brett Salkeld to kind of go into this a little deeper. He does a great dialogue with Dr. Gavin Ortlund. But again, I would disagree with some of the things in the way that Dr. Gavin lays out his understanding and reaction to Dr. Brett Salkeld here. But where I think this really comes into play is, okay, let me go back to this. In 1571, when the 39 Articles of Religion are written, when they're rejecting transubstantiation, what they're not rejecting, and this is what the Archic documents argue later, what they're not rejecting is the actual dogmatic claims of transubstantiation. What they are rejecting is a carnal view of the sacraments that's less about a substantial change and more about a carnal change. Okay, and that's somewhat understandable within context, okay, within historical context, because that did happen quite often in the Middle Ages. However, what is dogmatized at the Council of Trent is Thomas Aquinas's view, which is substantial change. Now, for example, if you read the ACNA Catechism of today, the Anglican Church in North America's Catechism, to be a Christian, it talks about in very clear language that what is outward appearance of bread and wine inwardly in a spiritual way is the body and blood of Christ, okay? And don't get hung up on that word spiritual. I have other videos that reference this, but what you can take that as is in substance at the core, what it most really is, what the Holy Spirit makes it to be in substance is body and blood, okay? And what it is on the outward appearance is what in the Latin tradition they would call the accidentals, okay? The viewpoint, and I've heard bishops such as Ray Sutton, if you know who that is, he's the primate of the Reformed Episcopal Church, was within the ACNA. I've heard him say in a video that basically Aquinas's view is absolutely, it has the capacity to overlap and interlock with the Anglican view, okay? So Aquinas's view is not the same as a fear of carnal views of the sacraments, okay? So in 1571, what they're rejecting is carnal views of the sacraments. And if you read it in context like that and recognize that they're not rejecting Aquinas's view, which is what is actually dogmatized at the Council of Trent, then it doesn't leave you in this place as a 21st century Anglican to go, oh, I hear transubstantiation, and that's still the word that Rome uses, so therefore I must reject it. No, you don't have to do that. You can read it contextually and say, the only thing that it's saying is not patristic is the carnal view, but the substantial view is in bounds, okay? And in general, Anglicans, that's to give an example, in general, Anglicans think of theology via historical context, and first and foremost, before going into systematic theology, okay? You also see this in a figure like N.T. Wright. When he's asked a question, it's always, let me go back to the story. Let's go back to the narrative. Let's go back to understanding the entire arc of Scripture. And when you understand the story, then you can understand the windows into it, okay? N.T. Wright would put it this way: you're answering first century questions with a 21st century answer, and not a 16th century question with a 19th century answer, okay? And that's very important. We're able to look at the arc of Scripture, we're able to understand it overall, and then say, where does this fit within, okay? We understand the Christian story overall, and then we can look at it contextually, and we can recognize that certain documents, again, such as the 39 Articles of Religion, are contextual within their context. And this is what John Henry Newman's trying to do in Tract 90, is he's trying to get beyond the polemics of the day and to say, at the core, what is the substantial teaching of Rome, substantial change, and what is the substantial what is the concern of the Anglicans, carnal eating, and then ask yourself, are these really in conflict, or is there ability to make real progress here when we get beyond some of the more systematic ways of dealing with this, which leaves you with the greater black and white thinking. Anglicans just in general, I'd say the English mind in general has more capacity for thinking where things can be a little fuzzier than they appear. I was going to save this quote for later, but I really want to read this quote by C.S. Lewis right now because it will give us an insight into what I'm talking about. So this is a quote that he wrote to his friend Don Giovanni Calabria on the 25th of November, 1947. But he writes this, if you know these names, about St. Thomas More and William Tyndale. St. Thomas More obviously being a Roman Catholic martyr, and William Tyndale being an Anglican martyr within the general time frame of the Reformation and around then. Okay? C.S. Lewis writes this, okay? And he's writing as an Anglican to his Roman Catholic friend. And see if you can see what I mean here about the less systematic, more contextual reality and more trying to find it within the greater narrative, okay? He writes, that the whole cause of schism lies in sin, I do not hold to be certain. I grant that no schism is without sin, but the one proposition does not necessarily follow the other. What would I think of your St. Thomas More and of our William Tyndale? All the writings of the one and all the writings of the other I have lately read right through. Both of them seem to me most saintly men, and to have loved God with their whole heart. I am not worthy to undo the shoes of either of them. Nevertheless, they disagree, and what racks and astounds me, their disagreement seems to me to spring not from their vices, nor from their ignorance, but rather from their virtues and the depths of their faith, so that the more they were at their best, the more they were at variance. I believe the judgment of God on their dissension is more profoundly hidden than it appears to you to be, for his judgments are indeed an abyss. Now, what is Lewis not saying there? He's not saying pluralism is okay. He's not saying, everybody's fine with what they believe. It's complicated. We'll never it's not a postmodernity. It's not a postmodern view of pluralism. Okay. What he is saying is as principled Christians who are endowed by the Holy Spirit in these serious theological traditions, these serious traditions that have passed down over hundreds and hundreds of years, millennia, that there's a lot of weight to them and that this is complicated. It's kind of like if you're familiar with Romans 9-11, the Jew and the Gentile, how will God humble all men so that all men recognize that they need the other to really understand like the full breadth of what God is doing. There's a sense in which, can we translate that to the church? I would say there's a sense in which we can. We have to, again, be careful of pluralism. I'm not advocating that. Neither is Lewis. But what he is arguing is a less polemical, less black and white form of thinking that allows for more generous views of the other position, and also the ability, even within a particular tradition, for their view to develop. Okay. Now, if anybody's familiar with the Anglican tradition, this is the history of Anglicanism. It's born kind of in the Celtic world in a sense. I mean, it's born earlier in the apostolic age. That's a whole long story. But it certainly has Eastern influence from the very beginning. There's a question of its Syriac origins. Again, I'm speaking of Anglicanism here. Did it have Syriac origins? Our liturgy suggests could possibly be. The Celtic tradition is certainly Eastern. It's mystical. It's very Eastern in its understanding. There's the strict sacraments, but there's also like a sacramentology, a sacramental view kind of the whole world and of all things. So that's very Eastern. And then it's got its Latin part that comes in 597 with St. Augustine coming from Pope St. Gregory the Great. And then it develops this whole great Western tradition, kind of culminates in a figure like Anselm. And then from there, we see in the Reformational period, we see this notion of it does have a reformed aspect, which I have to, as a high church Anglican, admit that that's part of our tradition. But then it also has the great Carolingian period, which is much more high church, much more Catholic, figures like William Laud. This is King Charles I, King Charles II time frame, the time of somebody like Lancelot Andrewes. And you have the very high view of the sacraments. And then you have the evangelical revival of the Wesleys in the 18th century, bringing in this religion of the heart notion, and also a deep sacramentology and Catholic method. Then in the 18th century, you've got the Tractarian movement, of which St. John Henry Newman is a part, and Edward Pusey. And then in the 20th century, you have an ecumenical movement. And so Anglicanism is not a static tradition, right? It's got all these different elements that in tension make it what it is. If you go to a historic Anglican church today, you're not going to find something that looks like the 16th century. You're going to find something that's deeply influenced by all of these periods and puts them together in tension, right? And the Roman Catholic Church is the same way. If you go to a Novus Ordo church, of which I do often, I have profound respect for the Roman Catholic Church, by the way. There's nothing negative for me coming from my mouth towards the Roman Catholic Church. They're my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I see them as full apostolic Christians. With that said, if you go to a Novus Ordo church in the conciliar period, post-Vatican II, you're going to find something that's going to look distinct from what it has been in earlier periods. These traditions aren't static. They grow and change. And so our theology has to be able to think that way too, where we're not just categorizing everybody in one time period and then thinking that the even views of the magisterium don't have ability to change, right? And by change, I don't mean change the core substance or dogmatic reality, but I mean that they continue developing in their understanding of what is the core of what is being said. Because dogma is always about the core and what's really going on at the very heartbeat. And so I hope everybody's hearing me right, because these are very careful and nuanced things that you could hear in a very wrong way, but I hope you're hearing them in a proper way. I'm not saying that the core of the apostolic faith doesn't change in any viewpoint, not in the Roman Catholic Church, not in the Anglican Church, none of that. However, it develops in a beautiful way that allows us to understand more perfectly and beautifully the heartbeat of the apostolic witness and of the apostolic tradition as lived out in these great traditions of Christendom. Okay, so with that said, that is one place where I think the English mind, and John Henry Newman is certainly a son of this, thinks contextually. And that's why, again, track 90, which is really the reason he got heat in England, was he trying to relate the 39 Articles of Religion with the Council of Trent and say there's not contradictions here. I got to be honest, I agree with him. and I hope that doesn't really frustrate my Anglican viewers, but at least hear me out about this. Arthur Michael Ramsey, if you know that name, he is the Archbishop of Canterbury during the time of Pope Paul VI and Vatican II. Um, he's the one that Pope Paul VI took off his episcopal ring and put it on the finger of Arthur Michael Ramsey. Okay, so this is a serious figure. He's the 100th Archbishop of Canterbury, and I would argue maybe the greatest Anglican mind of the 20th century. But Arthur Michael Ramsey, in a book that he writes, or it's a collection of some of his works, I believe, it's called The Anglican Spirit. He writes specifically that this method of Track 90 by John Henry Newman, although in some ways rejected in the 19th century by a large portion of the English world, actually has come to be in our modern day the way that ecumenical dialogue is done. So again, many people aren't even familiar with these groups, but ARCIC, A-R-C-I-C, the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, they've done 3 phases, 1, 2, and 3, but especially 1 and 2, okay, are extremely serious dialogues. And I would argue they're really the best ecumenical work that's ever been done, bar none, in the church between any 2 Christian groups. I don't think there's any other works that I've seen that I think rival these in the level of scholarship and thought and carefulness that went into them. From the Anglican tradition is led by a figure named Henry Chadwick. He's actually buried with a stole he got from Pope St. John Paul II. Okay, so again, these are serious people. And this is a serious dialogue. And you can find these on the internet. Just type in ARCIC 1 and 2, and even 3. 3 is a little different as it deals with more modern problems. But 1 and 2 deal with the Eucharist, with authority, with ministry, with Marian dogmas, with all sorts of stuff. And they find this profound consensus that does not hold them back in substance. And some of these old, polemical arguments, they're saying there's a way to find a core unity and substance of what is being said by both traditions. That method is based off of Track 90 from St. John Henry Newman. And so I think that is, again, a place where I would state disagreement that I don't think, and again, when I say this, I'm not putting any words into Dr. Ortlund's mouth. Again, he's somebody I respect profoundly. And I think so much of what he says is so fruitful. And so I actually think he might be the most fruitful, strictly Protestant apologist on the internet. Certainly close. So somebody that I watch his stuff to learn all the time. So this is not in an attacking way. What it is it's trying to say, sometimes though, I do fear that within Protestant circles especially, I'm not calling them nominalists. I don't think that they're nominalists. I like, certainly Dr. Ortlund is a Thomist. So he's got realism, excuse me here. He's got realism theology going on. But what is also going on in his purview is I do think sometimes some of the Protestant temptations of nominalism come in, where it's like black or white, this or not this. And again, I know that philosophically he's a realist, he's a Thomist, so he sees the ability for, the life of a saint to actually go to the glory of God. I'm not again putting words in anybody's mouth or thoughts in anybody's head. But what I am saying is I think sometimes that black and white category of thinking within the Protestant world can be hard to escape. And I think that the method of St. John Henry Newman can be a distinct way of working through that. Okay, so the third part of the video I want to touch on is what would be the other paradigm that I would give as a way to think through these questions, okay? So St. John Henry Newman was very famous for a particular quote that he made, essentially as to why he moved into the Roman Catholic world. And what he said is, the world judges rightly. The world judges rightly, okay? And what he meant by that was essentially that he feared that the Church of England was somewhat akin to the monophysite groups. So this would be like the Copts or the Ethiopians. And he was fearful that it was a unique sect as opposed to the fullness of the faith, okay? And so that led him into the larger category, which was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Dr. Gavin Ortlund in his video talks about is larger always right? And he makes some valid points when it comes to like what happens to infants who die, who are not baptized and those kind of things. He makes very good points about that. How sometimes the larger view is not always correct. And I agree with him about that. That does not make one right, okay? But what John Henry Newman meant is that he found it to be safer to go with what the larger consensus was over time as things had developed, okay? Now, what I want to propose is more of an ecumenical flavor on that. If I ever write a book, and I plan on doing it one day, I want to title it The World Judges Rightly, an Anglican reflection on St. John Henry Newman. And what I would mean by the world judges rightly is in more of the sense of St. Vincent of Lérins canon of what is believed always by everywhere and by all. And in a sense that the world judges rightly, in that the wisdom that God puts into various groups, that when they actually come together and are held in tension, something even more beautiful comes out, a more full understanding. So for example, one real quick note I would give on this, or one quick example I'd give, is the concept of anamnesis in the Mass or in the Eucharist. Now, what anamnesis is it's an understanding that comes from an old Jewish concept of the Seder meal and of the Passover, that when you as a Jewish person participate in the Seder meal, they're not just abstractly remembering what's going on, but they're actually participating in the Exodus in the present moment. And the church obviously picks up off of this and goes even further, that in the Eucharist or the Mass, what is going on is that the sacrifice of Christ is being represented on the altar each and every Mass. And so at the same time, in space and time are funny in Christian theology. It fits better with, I have another video on this, but it fits better with Einsteinian physics as opposed to Newtonian physics. A lot of Reformed thinking is based off Newtonian physics, God's omniscience, here, and here, rather than Einsteinian physics says time is funny and time and space bend. It fits beautifully with Christian theology. Anyways, I won't riff on that too much right now. But in the Mass, what's going on is the cross is coming into the present, and the eschaton, or the banquet, the heavenly banquet, is coming back in time into the present, and then all the tables of the saints are present at one, and there is one Mass and one sacrifice. So it's not a re-sacrifice of Christ, it's a representation of the sacrifice. And if you look, there's a great document that came out, I believe it was in the 1980s, called Baptism, Eucharist Ministry, BEM. And it's an ecumenical document that touches on agreement around anamnesis. Okay? Now, do you see what's going on here? At the time of the Reformation, the Reformers' concern was of re-sacrificing Christ. And the Roman Catholic concern was always about distancing the Mass from the sacrifice. And what's gone on over time, even if there were errors occurring on the ground at certain times in both ways, that probably happened quite a bit, that doesn't change the dogmatic reality of that what's at the core, the substance, is really about anamnesis. It's the representation of Christ. There's one Mass, one sacrifice, and we participate in it in the Holy Eucharist each and every time we gather for the Mass or for Eucharist. Do you see what this is? This is the world judging rightly, friends. Okay? Another example, again, in the Archic discussions around transubstantiation. Okay? What this says, and you can read this, again, 1971, you can find it online, it's easy to find. Okay? At the bottom, check the notes at the very bottom. Note number 2 literally says that the Roman Catholic Church does not strictly want to be bound by the Aristotelian, if what it's saying is if what you're struggling with is the Aristotelian framework, then that's what we need to get beyond, because that should not hinder the unity that we seek. Okay? You don't even take my word for it. Read Archic 1971 on the Eucharist. Note number 2. Okay? And what it ends with saying is we agree in substance on the Eucharist. And so the note that I like to give, and this is very N.T. Wright-esque, he loves to always look at the resurrection. I want to do this quick, and I'm drawing this specifically here. But in the resurrection of Christ, okay, what happens is the old has become completely new, okay? New creation has 100% launched. And the Roman Catholic concern and substance and dogmatically with the Eucharist is before the words of anaphora, before the words of consecration, it's bread and wine. Afterwards, and substance, and what it most really is at its core, it's body and blood. Okay? It fits beautifully with that notion of new creation. Old creation to new creation. Old creation to new creation. That's the Roman Catholic emphasis. The Anglican emphasis and the Reformers' emphasis always was, with that said, God also takes the old creation and perfects it, and then that comes into the new. Okay, so with Christ's resurrection, you can think about it this way. After he was risen, he still had the nail holes in his hands. It's still the same body, but it's been completely transformed. Okay, now if you look at the final paragraphs on this document, 1971 by Archic, they touch on what I'm talking about. They talk about that the new manna is completely new, but yet God has perfected the old creation in the new. And so both concerns about both traditions are brought into communion and into dialogue with one another. And then it concludes with saying, we agree in substance. These aren't mutually exclusive. They aren't dichotomous. Okay. That is, my friends, the world judging rightly. Okay. We can even do this. I won't go into this too deep. I'm an Anglican, and I'll tell you this right now, who believes in all the Marian dogmas. And I encourage others to believe in them because I think they're beautiful and profound. Okay. But what we don't need to do is get stuck in certain ways of thinking that make it, let's just pull up the historical documents from whenever. And I'm not saying that the historical documents don't matter, because they do. But the core of the dogma, again, like the Immaculate Conception, I'll focus on that, is, did Mary receive the benefits of baptism to be prepared to bear Christ? And again, an Einsteinian framework of physics and of time and space, kind of like we talked about the Eucharist, can that baptismal grace go back in time? Like, does that have to be something that leads us to this massive place of inability to agree? And again, the Roman Catholic and Anglican dialogues, this is up from Archic 2, I believe, on Mary, touch upon these topics and how we can kind of work through some of these things and how they have worked through some of these things. So I'm not trying to solve these. These topics are too big for this video. But what I am saying is that a different way of approaching them and trying to look for the best in the other position. And again, I know somebody like Dr. Ortlund does look for the best in the other position. I'm just saying a mind that is deeply steeped in the English mode of thinking and a contextual model rather than a systematic model, such as somebody like St. John Henry Newman, can start to approach these things in a different way that's less like yes or no, and it's more like, well, it's not yes or no. It is yes or no. It's not black or white, but it's, let's find the core substance that each are trying to say, and can they overlap and interlap? Now, real quick, two great English minds that have done this very thing, that have helped shape this within Anglicanism. One is named F.D. Morris. Okay, you can look up some of his writings. Again, talked about in Arthur Michael Ramsey's book, The Anglican Spirit. F.D. Morris was a man who was known for doing this. He would look for the absolute best in this tradition and the absolute best in this tradition and say, is there any conceivable possible way that these aren't dichotomous? And that was his great project. Okay, another figure that did this was William Temple, known for being an extraordinary synthesizer. Okay, and this is why Anglicans can talk to Lutherans, they can talk to Roman Catholics, and they can even talk to other groups like the Methodists or the Presbyterians, and they find common ground. And when you read their dialogues, they sound very fruitful, and there's a lot of agreement. It's because the Anglican mind in general, the English mind, is steeped in trying to healthily synthesize within an Orthodox, Apostolic, Nicene, Catholic framework. Okay, so F.D. Morris, William Temple are great examples of where, and Arthur Michael Ramsey, of where this has occurred, where this synthesizing method has occurred. And a lot of that actually stems from some of the great work of St. John Henry Newman. That's why he was named a doctor of the Universal Church. That's why, regardless of what you read on the internet, look at the Church of England is celebrating when he was named a doctor of the Universal Church. You've got the bishops from the Church of England going there to celebrate this. There's a reason for that. His Anglican writings are included in what is considered to be of great value for teaching the Catholic faith. And so that's the method that's going forward. By the way, I wanted to add one more thing. That 1971 document that I've been referencing on the Eucharist, it was unanimously confirmed by every province of the Anglican Communion in Lambeth 1988 as being, it teaches the Eucharistic doctrine of the Anglican faith. Okay? So regardless of what you think of what I'm saying, keep in mind, that is, I would argue, the official position of Anglicanism. That in 1988, that document was fully, unanimously by every province, affirmed that this teaches the Anglican doctrine of the Eucharist. Okay? And we can, the Roman Catholic acceptance of it is a little more complicated, but there's certainly an affirmation in many, many ways of its teaching. And somebody even, like, if you know the name Edward McNamara, I would label him a pretty conservative canon lawyer today. I was reading something from him the other day that was speaking about that, these things spoken of in Archic, they really do allow for substantial agreement. Okay, so this is not some obscure teaching. Okay, I would say this is the official teachings that come forth from this dialogue. So keep that in mind. Again, this would be my paradigm, an ecumenical one. The world judges rightly. The Vincentian canon, St. Vincent of Lérins, that allows us to go beyond this or this, systematic. And I love systematic theology too, but it's not, do you believe in this form or this form? And it's saying, what is the core dogma here and the core dogma here? And can they overlap and interlock in a way that is fruitful and that is really possible? And I don't think that's not being a jellyfish. It's not whitewashing differences. It's not painting over differences. It's trying to get beyond old arguments and try to find real unity. And even, friends, I'm going to say something here. I would argue Vatican II essentially is doing that. Vatican II actually uses, it certainly is drawn from the Roman Catholic tradition as well. It's using a lot of Anglican categories. Read Unitatis Redintegratio. It's very plene esse, if you know that term, towards the fullness of the faith. There's real communion with the all baptized, and then the apostolic faith leads you to a plene esse, to the fullness of the faith. It certainly draws from Anglican insights from a movement known as Lux Mundi in the late 19th century about how science and the natural world and the modern and the theological world can interlock and dialogue in fruitful ways. It's built off of the Nouvelle theologians such as Henry de Lubac, and one of the great Anglican minds. Why am I blanking on his name? Teaches at Nashotah House. I'll probably think of it. But one of the great Anglican minds in the ACNA that teaches at Nashotah House is a great theologian on Henry de Lubac. And he talks about how the Nouvelle theologians were based in that sometimes at certain points in the Roman Catholic world, sign and sacrament, there's been a heavy emphasis one way, of collapsing them together. And in the Protestant world, there's this heavy emphasis to separate sign and sacrament. But the healthy patristic way is sign and sacrament going together. That's the Augustinian way. And that the Nouvelle theologians are picking up on this. Well, that is the Anglican method, to hold sign and sacrament in the patristic way. And so you could argue that the way the Vatican II argues and the Nouvelle theologians argue about sign and sacrament, and again, you can think about the Eucharist with this, is actually very in tandem with the historic Anglican view and the historic Thomistic Roman Catholic view. Okay. And so again, this would be an area where the world judges rightly, where they actually are learning from one another. And God just in general kind of works like this. He wants us to learn from the other. And again, I don't mean to flatten out really complex things, because this is way too complicated to fully solve right here. But I'm saying it's an instinct, the notion of sign and sacrament gelling well together in a balanced way is the patristic method, it's the Anglican method, and it's the method of Vatican II. I would even argue, just real quick, it's interesting, if you follow the Synod and Synodality, which I, as an Anglican, love. I know there's different Roman Catholic views on it, but the Synod and Synodality, which I love, and there's no question it's the future of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, Pope Leo XIV has certainly affirmed what Pope Francis said with this. They're moving forward with it. The language they use at the core of the Christian message is the people of God. In Arthur Michael Ramsey's book, The Anglican Spirit, this is the language that he says we should be using. So he explicitly says, I think the best baseline answer is to call ourselves the people of God. And that's exactly what the Synod and Synodality picks up. Again, the world judging rightly. And there's just profundity in that. Within the Anglican tradition, is it the Reformed? Is it the Anglo-Catholics? Is it the Laudians, the High Churchmen? Is it the Low Churchmen? Is it the Evangelicals? Is it the Latitudinarians? Really, the best is when they're all held in tension, you have the Catholic faith, and in the English way, anyways. Again, the Catholic faith is much broader than the English tradition, but within our tradition, the Catholic faith really comes out in the tension in a lot of ways, and it's biblical, it's patristic, it's historical, and it applies via our reason. And so I just am the world judging rightly in that sense, in the sense of doctrinal carefulness and looking for the best in one another and trying to draw out the implications of the core dogma to synthesize them in any way possible. I think that is the ecumenical method, and I think that's the best method, and I think that's the method that's going to win the day. Sorry again. I think that's the method that is going to win the day in the end, essentially. I am so sorry, guys. This video is too long for me to redo it. But anyway, so keep that in mind. Okay. I want to close. I'm rambling a little bit, but I want to close right now with a great quote from Arthur Michael Ramsey, which I think kind of sums up so much of what I'm saying. This is written in a book that he wrote in 1936 as he was a young man called The Gospel and the Catholic Church. Okay, it's one of the greatest, most coherent quotes I've ever heard, and it's really based upon that as Christians we're called to take up our cross and follow the way of Christ. Okay, that Christian traditions as well are called to take up their cross, lead cruciform lives, and in that draw the truth unto themselves, okay, and draw the fullness of Christendom unto themselves. Let me just read Arthur Michael Ramsey's quote here. Listen carefully to this. The Anglican tradition, while vindicated through a strikingly balanced witness to the gospel, to the church, and to sound learning, its greater vindication lies in pointing through its own history to something of which it is a fragment. Its credentials are its incompleteness, with the tension and travail in its soul. It is clumsy and untidy, and it baffles neatness and logic. For it is sent not to commend itself as the best type of Christianity, but through its very brokenness to point to the universal church, wherein all have died. I'm going to read that again. While the Anglican tradition is vindicated by its place in history through a strikingly balanced witness to the gospel, to the church, and to sound learning, its greater vindication lies in pointing through its own history to something of which it is a fragment. Its credentials are its incompleteness, with the tension and travail in its soul. It is clumsy and untidy, and it baffles neatness and logic. For it is sent not to commend itself as the best type of Christianity, but through its very brokenness to point to the universal church, wherein all have died. My friends, follow the line of apostolic Christianity that the Holy Spirit has led you to. I really mean that. As an Anglican, I'm not really interested in Roman Catholics becoming Anglicans. I want them to be Roman Catholics. I'm not really interested in Eastern Orthodox becoming Anglicans. I want them to be Eastern Orthodox. I want us to follow the fullness of the faith as best enlightened by the scriptures. And we do have there are certain things that we draw from our own traditions that I think are pertinent to our own faith. And I could lay out the reasons why I'm Anglican, an Anglican Catholic. With that said, the fullness of the faith is found in the breadth of apostolic Christianity. And the more that we can look for the good in the other and recognize that it has something to add to our tradition, and that together as apostolic Christians, and the way the Anglicans have historically laid this out is there's a fourfold thing. Do you believe in the Bible? Do you believe in the sacraments? Do you believe in the Nicene Creed? And do you have apostolic succession? Do you have the historic episcopate? If you have those four things, there is a real plene esse that exists. And obviously there's other doctrines matter as well, but through that fullness we're drawn closer together. And we can take the distinctions that we hold dear, but bring them into the fullness of the Catholic faith, and then share them with one another, keep working at things, keep looking for the best in the other, and have ecumenical impulses to let the world judge rightly beyond our own judgment. Let the Church Catholic judge rightly beyond our own assumptions, our own interpretations, and our own theological methods. Let the Church teach us, not just our wisdom. Okay, so that's what I want to plug today. If you like this content, keep in mind we've got a lot of other videos that touch on various things. I have a full one that's very long on the Eucharist that I think is really worthwhile listening to. That's what I have for us today. God's peace to you, my friends. Pray for the unity of Christ, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Again, I want to say nothing but positive and beautiful things about the Roman Catholic tradition, Dr. Gavin Ortlund, a man I really respect, and may God guide us all closer to his truth and to his will. And till next time, God's peace.